powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Now, live from inside the Matt Black Kia Studios. This is Football at 4.
Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast, guys. Geoff Mosher is here, InsideTheBirds.com and the Inside the Birds podcast. Obviously, a lot happening in the NFL. Eagles got a bunch of stuff on the horizon. We'll take a look at what's next for this team as they get ready for Monday, which is legal tampering. You'll start to hear this guy is going to sign there, and this guy is going to sign there. And I would imagine, Geoff Mosher, I want to get your thoughts on this. We've talked a lot about the Eagles free agents and who they might bring back and who they might target and who they might lose. But we haven't heard a whole heck of a lot about what the Eagles free agent plan might be. Are they going to be a team that fans should be keeping their ears and eyes open on Monday when legal tampering begins? Do you think they might lose guys, but will they be active in replacing them?
Mike, I'm glad you asked that. This opens up a conversation that I think is important to have, because hearing a lot of people talk, right? I'm sure you're getting this too also from people who text you in and talk to you, that, what are the Eagles going to do? Or they were so close to the Super Bowl. Now they're going to lose all these guys. Now all of a sudden they're not going for it. It seems like there's a lot of concern, right, with how many guys the Eagles are going to lose and the reality that they're not going to have a ton of money once they pay Jalen Hurts to go out there and quote unquote go for it, sort of like they just did last offseason. But I think everybody needs to step back and relax and remember that there is an in-between world, and this is the world that most NFL teams live in, between going for it, going to push the pedal to the metal, like you could say the Eagles did last year with their collection of talent, and rebuilding completely. The Eagles are going to exist in that middle because Howie Roseman has never, ever once, not once, felt like he wanted to go into a year losing or with the understanding that they're not in it to win it. There are certainly times he's built better rosters than others, like last year, but when have you ever heard Howie say, we know we got to take a step back and we'll be lucky to make the playoffs this year? He's never said that. He has never felt that. And what Howie does really well, and I think we all have to remember this, is take advantage of the secondary market, the weeks after the first 2 weeks of free agency to fill holes, right? The trade market, getting a guy like Timmy Jernigan a couple of years ago in 2017, who was on that, going into that fourth year and wasn't going to get an extension from the Ravens, but was still a good player and played an important role for the Eagles. Same thing with C.J. Gardner-Johnson last year. The Eagles and Howie Roseman are not just going to wave the white flag. They may not be able to put together a defense on paper that was as good as it was last year, but you have, as you and I have talked about this, you have an offense that is almost entirely coming back and should be very, very explosive and prolific next year. And he is going to find ways with his draft picks, his draft compensation, and the trade market and that secondary free agent market to be able to put a team on the field that should be very competitive next year. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is you're not going to be day one free agency and hit that home run, I would imagine. You're going to see, hey, Hargrave is going to sign here and Bradbury's going to go there and possibly Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. Now I want to get your thoughts on that coming up in just a second. But you're most likely going to see that those three big names are going to be walking, and you might be sitting there that first day with nothing.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen that in the past with this team. I mean, yeah, last year they were players on the first day because they signed Hassan Reddick, and that was a big need for them. Again, they had the ability with a quarterback under a rookie contract, right, to go for it. But the year that they signed Carson Wentz to the big deal, I don't remember them being huge players in free agency. And in fact, during that whole sort of time period, 18, 19, 20, they were more economical. They would make a trade for Michael Bennett. They signed Malik Jackson, who was a good defensive tackle. Now he wound up being hurt a lot, right, for the Eagles, but they signed him thinking he was going to be a starting DT for them, and he was a guy who was a good player who just happened to be a cap casualty the way, say, Frank Clark is right now. Now, Frank Clark's probably going to have a pretty good market, just using him as an example. Don't know that the Eagles will go out and get him, but my point is, there will be players. There always are. It just sometimes takes a little time for things to develop. Nobody knew C.J. Gardner-Johnson, including Howie Roseman, was going to be available at this time last year because he had to kind of run his course with the Saints, and they had to finally come to the point where they were going to realize that an agreement wasn't going to be done, and then he would be available via trade market. So that's really what you're looking at with the Philadelphia Eagles. Losing big names starting, Monday, understanding that that's where the reality of their situation, but not being aggressive either. They'll be smart when they can be.
Yeah, and I would imagine, I want to get your take on, I think we've touched on maybe Milton Williams a little bit, but we were going a little deeper. He played 36% of the snaps last year, at 36 tackles, 4 sacks. I mean, could they ask him to play? Hey, we're going to ask you to go from 36 to 50, 55%. Do they look at him as a guy that can maybe replace some of that pass rushing production from Hargrave? And then you have Jordan Davis playing more, so you're hoping he takes up more run stuffing ability.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and it's really hard to answer it without sort of knowing exactly what Sean Desai's preference is yet for defensive linemen, or just defensive personnel in general. Yeah, sure, he's going to run concepts of the Fangio scheme, but we don't know that he's going to be, every coach and coordinator has sort of their own different preferences for what they want. So we have to find that out. But you can pretty much say every defensive coordinator likes guys who can rush the passer. There's no doubt about that. And so they'll be looking at Milton Williams. Now, I don't know how much more he can play because he's more of a pass rusher. He has done well when asked to play. The short arms was a big deal coming out of college. They weren't sure if he'd be a great run stuffer, getting off blocks and everything like that. I'm sure he'll get an opportunity to see if he can do that more. But, yeah, he can make up in the pass rush. You just got to make sure that you're getting the opponent in good pass rushing scenarios. You got to be able to stop the run, and that goes to your point on Jordan Davis and his ability to progress next year and develop and be able to play more than 5 or 6 snaps at one time. And clearly they're going to have to get another defensive tackle, some kind of veteran, somebody with run-stopping ability, or else you're relying on, like, Marlon Tuipulotu coming off his injury to do that.
Yeah, he's a guy that played a lot last year, too, before he got hurt, by the way. So we'll see how he refactors back in because he got hurt. And then Jordan Davis, well, I guess Davis got hurt first. Then Tuipulotu got hurt. And that's when they went on the street and found Linval Joseph and then Ndamukong Suh. And then, really those guys took a bunch of the snaps over. So I think the Hargrave one, obviously, there was a report today. Schefter said that basically those 3 guys are as good as gone. Do you also agree that all 3 of those guys will be gone?
It's funny. I listened to exactly what he said because I wasn't sure I felt the same way. I mean, I think there's a chance of it, sure. And then, later he sort of said, well, 2 out of 3 almost assuredly, maybe not 3 out of 3. And I think, that's probably a fair assessment of it. I think the hardest guy to put a number on or projection on is C.J. Gardner-Johnson, right? Because what is he? Is he a safety? If he's a safety and you're judging him against, say, Kevin Byard, who's, a Pro Bowler, or you're judging him against Jesse Bates, who's probably going to reset the safety market in free agency. Those guys, Byard makes $14 million a year. Bates will probably get more than that, being the top free agent. And those guys are safeties, and they're really good safeties. C.J. Gardner-Johnson had a lot of interceptions and a very splashy statistical line, but he did not play the conventional safety role for the Eagles. He played some deep, he played some box, he played some coverage as a nickel, which in one way makes you good and enticing to teams because you have optionality. But in other ways, you're also kind of playing positions that are not premier positions. And if someone's looking at CJ saying, I think in my scheme, he's actually a better nickel corner than a safety, or he's like 50% safety, 50% nickel, then what I'm trying to do is find a price tag that's somewhere between what the good safeties and what the good nickels make. So that's like somewhere between 14 million and 8 million. So now you're looking at 10 or 11, right? I mean, we're just sort of tossing around numbers and with that philosophy in mind, and 10 or 11 million is less than what the franchise tag number is, which I think was around 14 million. So you can kind of understand where the Eagles are coming from here. The way they played C.J. Gardner-Johnson was in that hybrid safety role, hybrid nickel. They moved him around, and I don't know that they wanted to pay him what like Kevin Byard and some of the best pure safeties make, and what Jesse Bates might make. And so it sounds like, I'm me judging this from afar.
Yep.
They're saying, why don't you go ahead, test the market, and see what you get. And if some other team values you as a $15 to $17 million safety, God bless you. But if not, come back to us and let's really talk about your role and your evaluation of it.
Geoff Mosher from Inside the Birds podcast and InsideTheBirds.com. What's going to happen with TJ Edwards? To me, he's an interesting one because I think the Eagles would love to bring him back. They kind of found him. They developed this guy. And the problem is I think there's going to be a team out there that's going to offer him a deal that he can't refuse.
That's probably what we're looking at, Mike. Now, there are some pretty good linebackers on the market. That's not going to help his – a guy like Bobby Wagner is out there now. So maybe that doesn't help TJ Edwards because somebody better is on the market, right? But it's my understanding, good sourcing tells me he's going to have several offers, at least 3 and maybe more, okay? We know the Eagles don't typically pay for linebackers. They'll make some offers sometimes. The whole Nigel Bradham thing was like $8 million, but it was sort of not really $8 million. You had to reach incentives. So when they didn't pay Jordan Hicks, they let him walk to Arizona. So this is a case where TJ Edwards has to decide, well, here's what I suspect. He'll have to decide. Do I want the most money or do I want to be a Philadelphia Eagle? For a lot of players, whether you're on the Eagles or 31 other teams, you want the most money. Some players are willing to take less if it's close to go somewhere else, or if it's tied, they go somewhere, depends. And then it'll come down to, do the Eagles want to come close to matching the best offer? It's very unlikely they're going to make the best offer. And then where does TJ fall on it? Does he really want to be an Eagle to the point where he's willing to accept less than what he's offered? And again, is it close or is it not close? Sometimes, no matter how much your heart tells you love being with a team, there's a certain amount of money you're not willing to leave on the table.
Right.
And that's where it's gonna fall somewhere in that area for TJ Edwards.
Don't you feel that the Eagles would love to go back next season with Edwards and Dean rather than White and Dean?
Yes. I think they would love that.
That would be their preference, right? So do they?
That would be their preference.
Yeah. So do they, bump? That's the thing. They are so disciplined with that kind of stuff, generally anyway. Yeah.
There's a big difference between evaluation and valuation. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that the Eagles aren't willing to bend, but hey, look, Jordan Hicks was a really good player for them. Now, he was a guy who had an injury history, so I'm sure that factored in back then to the conversation, but he was a really good linebacker for them. Arizona made an offer. The Eagles didn't match it, and they, it hurts. It hurts when you don't have when you have to rebuild. You saw what they had at linebacker for a couple of years there, right?
Well, yeah.
Gary and Duke Riley. I mean, that hurt them, no question.
Well, right, and how much, Moshe, is this a byproduct of having to pay the quarterback as well? That, hey, we would love to bring these guys back and maybe pay you a little bit more, but the byproduct is we also know we have to pay the quarterback. So how much does that factor in to everything that's going to start on Monday?
It's huge. It's huge. And I think Howie Roseman was pretty honest about that at the podium last week in Indianapolis. He knows he's going to have to pay his quarterback. Now, I think people sort of get a warped sense sometimes that if you have to pay your quarterback, you no longer compete for an – I hear this all the time. How many teams that paid a quarterback win a Super Bowl? And I'm like, well, just 3 weeks ago. Patrick Mahomes got paid. He won a Super Bowl. So it's not impossible, and there are definitely advantages to the fact that his salary this year, his cap hit, is low because they can store some of the new money into this year, bring him up a lot, but still keep him lower than the 50 to 55, right? While still paying him the same amount of guaranteed money that he's owed. So there are some things they can do from a contract maneuvering standpoint to make it a little bit easier, but we're talking about a little bit easier. The bottom line is what they just had this past season is a luxury that they and many other teams don't ordinarily have. They took advantage of it to the best of their ability. They made the Super Bowl. They just didn't win it.
Yeah. There's a lot of things they have to try to think about and do. One is I want to get your take. Geoff Mosher from InsideTheBirds.com and the Inside the Birds podcast. It's Football at 4. How have things maybe changed for Miles Sanders now after the franchise tags?
Yeah, I mean, you would think with Tony Pollard and Saquon Barkley and who else am I missing is off the market now?
Josh Jacobs.
There's Josh Jacobs, right. That any team out there that was really trying to make a splash at running back is either saying Miles Sanders is our next guy up, so whatever money we had allocated for free agent running back he gets, which is good for Miles Sanders, or maybe they're saying, there was a distinction here between those three who got tagged and Miles. He's a little bit below, and some teams stick by the valuation like the Eagles do, and some teams don't. And they'll not afraid, like the Jacksonville Jaguars, you can't tell me they evaluated Christian Kirk as a $20 million a year wide receiver. They thought he was good, right? But I'm sure they knew to get him, they would have to overpay. And perhaps that will be the case for Miles Sanders for another team. But, Mike, maybe it won't. I never like to speak in absolutes with free agency because you just never know, right? But theoretically, to your point, it should benefit Miles Sanders that he and the kid from the Bears, whose name is all of a sudden David Montgomery, are probably 1 or 1A, however you evaluate them, as the top running backs on the market.
Yeah. It's hard to ask this question because I don't know that there's really a legitimate answer, but if they did spend money in one spot in free agency, do you have a thought?
If they spent money in one spot in free agency, that is a great question. Well, it's probably not going to be linebacker, right? And I think if you're going to let James Bradbury walk because you're not paying that after that good year he had, you're trying to get younger there, so you're probably not paying money there. Safety is interesting, Mike, only because you can say, well, why would they pay money at safety if they let C.J. Gardner-Johnson walk? Well, because it's a deep safety market. And there are actually some pretty good, like a Von Bell. There are some pretty interesting safeties out there. We went through this with Greg Cosell last week. If you go look at the top 10 safeties, Jordan Poyer, I mean, there's some pretty decent names of guys who can actually play. They may not be superstars, but Mike Edwards from Tampa Bay, who, again, I'm not saying are going to get blockbuster deals, but because there's 8 or 9 or 10 guys, you get the 7th best safety. He can play for you, and he'll probably command a little bit, decent contract, but not like 12 to 14 million a year. So I think your question was more geared toward that, like you're paying, but you're not giving blockbuster money to, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, hey, we're going to lose somebody, but we will spend a little money to bring somebody new in.
Yeah, sure. Julian Love, like from the Giants, he's a free agent. I don't think he's going to get top of the line safety money, but he might get middle of the line safety money, and maybe that's something the Eagles feel like, all right, well, we didn't pay C.J. Gardner-Johnson 14 to 15 million a year, but we paid this guy 7 to 8 million a year. He's younger or just as young, and we think he's pretty good too.
Yeah, Julian Love, by the way, SpotTrack.com says his market value is $7.9 million a year, which is about half of what they say for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. They have $13 million for Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. So
right, look at that. I was very close with my projections, just right off the top of my head with you, and I didn't even look at that.
There, you are very good, and
Julian's a good safety. Like you can win. You can play with Julian Love. You can line up and do what you want to do defensively, and feel all right with yourself when you have Julian Love.
Well, I guess one question would be, we see all the interceptions from Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, and people get enamored with stats and numbers. Sacks. You get a lot of sacks, that must mean you're really good. You get a lot of interceptions, that must mean you're really good. I don't know. I mean, is he replaceable by just plugging another guy into that spot, and does that guy become a productive player?
No, I mean, again, you're clearly losing something. I don't think C.J. Gardner-Johnson's number of interceptions was a fluke. I think that, I remember a couple of years ago when the Eagles signed Anthony Harris, and people were so excited because he wore the franchise tag with the Vikings the year before. He had led the NFL in interceptions, and it just didn't compute. He was an undrafted free agent. He was a backup thrown into a starting role. Like, it didn't make sense that he had this year where he led the NFL in interceptions. So you call around, you find out that, he was sort of like one of those years where you just had in the right place at the right time, and the reason really he got the franchise tag was because the Vikings really needed their safeties at the time, and they had the money to be able to do it. It wasn't because they felt he was a franchise tag type player. I'm not going there with C.J. Gardner-Johnson. I think he's good and he made really good plays. But at the same time, going into this year, Mike, C.J. Gardner-Johnson was considered like a good nickel cornerback the way Avonte Maddox is considered a good nickel cornerback. And that's usually like a $7 to $8 million a year player, right? So he did have this amazing year. I don't think that should per se influence people into thinking he's Ed Reed and he should be paid like the way Ed Reed was when Ed Reed played. So there's definitely an in-between there.
Oh yeah, I do you agree that listen, he got the safeties, picks, interceptions, but the amount of interceptions he got may warp our thought of what type of player he is.
Yeah, and again, not taking away from him, a little bit unsustainable to think he was going to have 14 or 15 interceptions this year and then do it every year going forward. But he is a good player, and to point to the question you asked me, if you're letting him go, if you're not going to sign him at that money and you replace him with a Von Bell or a Julian Love or somebody else, you don't have as good of a defense, theoretically, unless those, you never know young players, they can come into their own, but theoretically, you're taking an L there or a net loss in talent, but we already knew going into this offseason that you were going to have to do that at several positions, and that's where you hope that your second-year guy, like you said, the Kobe Dean and Jordan Davis and whoever you draft in the first round this year, along with those kind of market bargain signings that you'll make later in May and June, come together and give you a formidable to good defense. You don't have to be elite all the time. Yeah, like we said with this Chiefs team that just won the Super Bowl, this Chiefs team was not as good as the first Chiefs team that won the Super Bowl with Tyreek Hill and Tyrann Mathieu. Maybe not even as good as last year's team that didn't win the Super Bowl, but they were good enough this year to win because their other players developed.
And we talked about development, right, when we talked about a guy like Milton Williams, and that's what the Eagles have to have trust in is we're going to lose guys in free agency. We have to have somebody step into that spot and pick up the slack. And that's one area where I think they possibly could. Obviously, they have Nakobe Dean, so I think they can do that at linebacker. But safety and corner, do they have those refills? Well, we'll see. It all starts on Monday. We have plenty more. Football at 4 tomorrow. Andrew's here. Adam's back on Friday. And the Inside the Birds podcast, you can check out the intel. They've got a bunch on their platform, InsideTheBirds.com. And the Inside the Birds podcast, get it wherever you download your podcast. He is Geoff Mosher. This has been Football at 4. Jeff, appreciate it, man.
Great stuff, Mike. Thanks.
Always good. Geoff Mosher here on the Sports Bash Live, 97.3 ESPN. I do agree. That was great stuff. He gave us a lot of information.